Recording has started. So good morning, everybody. My name's Sandra. I'm an MND advisor, support coordinator, and also team leader with MND Queensland. Today, our guest speaker is Dr Gethin Thomas, and Gethin's on board at this moment in time. So just a little bit of housekeeping. As I said before, the session will be recorded, and if you could please keep your microphones on mute, just as a courtesy for Gethin. And at the end of this session, which there's quite a lot of information in it, there'll be some time open for questions. If we don't get enough time for questions, then you can actually email me, and I'm sure that Gethin would answer those questions at a later date. So over to you, Gethin.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you all for coming on today. Yep, and as Sandra said, I'm always happy to answer questions. So if you can try and remember them as we go through and fire them all at the end, I'm sure we'll have some time to try and answer any of your queries. So my slides are up, is that correct, Sandra?
Yes, they are.
Great. So this is just, those of you who dialed in last time, I'll try not to repeat too much of what I said, so I'll kind of move it along a bit from that. But just a little bit of real basic background. So MND Research Australia is the research arm of MND Australia. It was established way back in 1984, and we actually were a separate organisation until 2010 when we amalgamated with MND Australia and became their research arm. Right. Okay. Sorry, I'm just working out how this
that works. It's moved.
Yep. Great. Cool. So what I thought I'd actually do is take you back to a couple of basics today as well. Is a real sort of definition of what is research. What do we describe as research? A lot of people talk about it, but quite often I think people are less sure what are the nuts and bolts. So basically, research is defined as the creation of new knowledge and or the use of existing knowledge in a new and creative way. So that way you generate new concepts or methodologies or understanding. So this can actually build on old research or previous research and reanalysis of it, as long as it leads to something basically new and creative. So what criteria do we actually need to be fulfilled? So it needs to be aimed at new findings. You want to direct your research needs to find something new. It has to be based on an original concept, so something new as well. It's got to have a creative element to it. So you've got to be thinking of a new idea. You can't know the answer in advance. There's no point. It's not research. So you need to be uncertain. And it needs to be planned and budgeted. There has to be a sort of project plan for it. So it has to be systematic. And then also it has to be reproducible. Any results you produce from your research project, someone else must be able to come in and do the same project and get similar results. So the real basics of how you go about undertaking a research project. So first of all, you've got to ask a question. You've got to have a question. It could be, something like, how do we cure MND? That could be a question. It's a very big one. Then you set a hypothesis. You think, we could cure MND by treating people with this specific drug. So that's your hypothesis, basically. And then you set and collect the analysis. In that case, it would be a clinical trial. So you test people with the drug and you test people with a control drug. And then you answer the question, you analyze the data and you say, did this treatment cure MND? So in a real simple nutshell, that's how you undertake a research project. But there's lots of different, that was a specific example of a clinical trial. There's a number of different ways in which you can undertake research, especially when we're talking about sort of biomedical research, which obviously what we do in the MND area. So the first one is pure basic research. So this is just to acquire new knowledge without perhaps looking for longer term benefits, apart from the advancement of knowledge. So people might not be thinking this is as much benefit to MND, but it certainly is, because it's understanding basic biological mechanisms, and many of these might be disrupted in MND. So it's really just finding out how your body works, how your cells work, and then how we can understand that, and we can see then how they might be disrupted. Next one is strategic basic research. So this is how we take the work, sort of basic research, but this is actually directed into a specific broad areas that are going to be useful, we think will be useful to us. So this would be, say, genetics in MND. So how can we identify genetic mutations that specifically lead to MND, rather than maybe looking at the basic, just how a cell works, or we'd be looking at how is a cell disrupted in MND. So applied research is basically how we actually going to undertake research that actually answers a very specific question that will lead to an application in your field. So for us in MND. So a simple answer to that is a clinical trial. We're asking the question, how can we, will this drug help people with MND? Yes or no? And then finally, the sort of more complex or less sort of definitive area is experimental development. This is using existing knowledge that's already been out there or gained from research, practical experience, and then how can we add that and improve what we do. So this will be an example of better models of care, such as how can we improve non-invasive ventilation, or develop better assistive technology, such as brain and computer interfaces. Sorry, I'm just playing with my computer again. Okay, right. So similar as I said last time, we have 4 basic challenges in MND that all our research is directed at. One is what causes it, what is disrupted, why do your motor neurons die? Secondly, how do we actually measure disease progression? That's a big problem in MND. One is that's going to help with diagnose. How do we better diagnose it? And secondly, how do we know if a drug is working? I mean, we have things like the ALS, FRS, and other factors, but none of them are great. And we really want to have better ways of quickly and accurately measuring what's going on with your motor neurons. Obviously, the third one is developing and testing new treatments. That's probably where most of the effort goes into. And then obviously there's still a lot of people living with this disease, so we need to make sure that the clinical and healthcare that we provide to people is the best it could possibly be. So we need to keep working on improving those aspects of MND. So in Australia, we're very lucky. We have a very well established sort of research ecosystem that's well supported by funding from ourselves, and obviously more recently Fight MND have really added to the funding available and the amount of the research that's going on in Australia. But again, if we look at the whole ecosystem, again, I'll split it into 3 basic areas. How do we understand the cause and mechanisms underlying the disease? How do we get treatments and clinical trials, and improving clinical care? So we've got a number of different partners and players within this system. So across Australia, we've got probably about 7 or 8 research centres where probably 90% of our research actually takes place. Macquarie University has the biggest dedicated MND research centre. Then that's based in Sydney. The Florey Institute in Melbourne also has a very large groups looking at MND. University of Tasmania has a couple of groups that are very strong. University of Queensland is probably the 2nd biggest team of researchers after Macquarie, or very similar in size. Perrin Institute over in Perth, Flinders University in Adelaide, and the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. These are several centres where the real core research takes place. And most of these research centres are really looking to support the treatment, clinical trials, and the better understanding of the disease. Then we're also very fortunate in Australia to have a network of multidisciplinary clinics. This is well established to be the best form of treatment for MND. The best care that can be provided is through these multidisciplinary clinics. And there's clinics in Sydney, Adelaide, Melbourne, Geelong, There's one up at the Sunshine Coast, I believe, and obviously in Brisbane and in Perth as well. And these then are linked in also to much of the research, obviously improving the clinical care, and also this is where most of the clinical trials come through these clinics. Based on these through the clinics, we have developed 2 biobanks, they're called. These are basically stores for samples taken from patients and from their relatives that allow the basic research centres to undertake experiments to work out perhaps what changes are going on in patients with MND. So there's one at Macquarie and there's one at Flinders in South Australia. And these are, Flinders are very much focused on identifying new biomarkers and new ways of measuring disease. Macquarie Biobank has a strong genomics focus and also looking at different mechanisms, what's changing in those cells. More recently, we're developing a clinical trials network. So all the labs or the clinics in Australia that are running clinical trials are all now working together to make sure we've got bringing in more and more clinical trials, as many as we can, into Australia. Sitting in this as well is MindOz, which is our clinical registry. This is basically a patient database. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. Underlying all the clinical care are the state associations, and sitting as a kind of an umbrella organisation above the state associations is MND Australia. So, and then also in a more basic side, we also have a facility at the Florey Institute in Melbourne, which actually collects cells from patients, and we can grow those into neurons and look at how the neurons then in a lab environment, we can start looking directly at neurons derived from people with MND. And stemming from this sort of studies is the Australian Preclinical Research ALS, the APRILS network, which is a group of basic researchers who are all working together and sharing reagents and resources to try and push through new treatments through the preclinical stages, the basic research stages, so they can move into clinical trial more quickly. And all this is not possible without research funding. As I said, MNDRA sitting there as a major research funder, as do FightMND. MNDME, also based in Queensland, support research, mostly through us. They also have some of their own grants. There's Racing for Mindy, which is a small charity over in Perth that funds genetics research. And then we have the national bodies as well, the MRFF, and the Medical Research Future Fund, and the National Health and Medical Research Council have about close to $2 billion a year to fund research right across the medical research spectrum now. So fortunately, not a lot of that goes to MND research. It funds everything. So most of our research money comes from us and FightMND. And then the pharmaceutical industry also help to fund things like clinical trials, studies like that. So a couple of organisations we've established across Australia. We have the MND Collective. So this is an organisation of us and FightMND have put together, and we're trying to bring together all the different facets of Australian and New Zealand MND research. So the idea is it encourages collaboration and resource sharing. The idea is it minimises duplication and makes sure everyone else knows what's going on, so we don't copy what we're doing. The other really key element to this is that we have a lived experience voice. There are people with people with MND, people, carers, ex-carers, are all advising us on some of the research that we should be doing, the directions we should be taking. So there's a lot of communication going on there. And it's basically just making sure everyone knows what we're doing. So a few of the achievements that the collective have aimed for. So one of the core aims is accelerating discoveries and treatments. So what we really want to do is develop a resource map. We are identifying who's doing what in Australia, basically, and who's got what resources, so everyone can access those. We also want to identify priority research areas and workshops. We're doing that at the moment. We just held one a few weeks ago, and we're establishing the National Clinical Trials Network. We're also establishing portals and communication for people to find out about clinical trial information. we have the web page on MND Australia. We want to build that up to make it more current and a better source of information. We also want to improve the standard of care and the experience of people living with MND through research education. So one way we're doing that as well, we're making sure all our care research, people involved in healthcare research, are now talking to each other. That's another aspect of the collective as well. We're producing some nationally endorsed guidelines on the standards of care. This is currently being developed at the moment. Better engagement with NDIS and My Aged Care, that's a role for MND Australia to play. And we want to develop evidence-based tools to address the needs of family and carers to really make sure we support people as best we can. The collective has now got state-based nodes, so it allows everyone in the state, both patients and researchers, right across the spectrum to engage with each other, talk to each other. As I said, we've got these resource maps where we know what everyone in Australia in the MND research is doing and what facilities they have and what their research interests are. And we're also building up a framework to help more junior researchers to build up their skills and make sure they want to stay in the MND field and they do as well as they possibly can. I mentioned briefly the MND partnership, the MindDOS partnership before. So this is what we call a patient registry. So this is where we collect all the details from as many patients as we can, and we keep following them then through the course of their disease. So it allows us to build up a database of how people's disease progresses. Perhaps there's information there about what they think might have caused their disease, what treatments they're taking, and over time that builds up into an incredibly informative database. It also lets us know, allows us to identify who might be eligible for clinical trials, as well as identifying different groups of patients, say with genetics as well. We also have a genetic component to our database. This involves all the clinics and MND associations across Australia, and the target is to recruit at least 80% of patients and carers with MND are involved in this database. And the next step is also then to start collecting information from carers themselves as well. I'm sure, as you're all aware, it's there's an incredible burden on carers, and we need to get more information about that and how can we help to make sure we're caring for our carers, basically. So just go back now. So previously when I spoke to you, I kind of gave a more generic overview of the research in Australia. What I want to do now is just to identify some more specific projects and developments that are happening both in Australia and more widely around the world. So here's a couple of projects that have recently, these are lab-based projects, so I'll try and keep the explanation pretty simple, that are happening at the University of Queensland. So Rebecca Sangill and her team at the University of Queensland have done some large-scale analysis at the actual protein changes that are happening in brain cells. So they've used a mouse model of MND, they've taken the brain cells out, and then they've actually looked at each protein in those cells and looked how they're changing. And this allows them to produce a molecular map of the changes in the cell. And they've done this at different stages of the disease, so very early and much later in the disease. And this gives them some targets now to start thinking, okay, what can we target? What's changing? Okay, once we know what's changing, we think, how can we target those changes and as a potential therapy in the future? Another group, Dr. Adam Walker and his team at the University of Queensland are looking at this protein TDP43. So pretty much in every case of MND, this protein TDP43 is disrupted. It sits in your cell where it shouldn't be. It accumulates in big lumps in your cell, and that's very toxic, and this is what basically kills your motor neurons. So they've built some mouse models where they mimic the human disease by creating a defective TDP43 protein, and now they're looking at what happens in these mouse models when they start to develop MND. And one of the key findings they found is that you get these things called cell stress. So, you know, like we all deal with stress, but cells as well, when you're too hot, you're too cold, under pressure, cells feel stress and they have these mechanisms to deal with that normally. But when those mechanisms go wrong, it can lead to the cells misbehaving and then dying. And this is what happens in motor neurons. And they've identified that basically the cells experience what you might call chronic stress. So the idea is that perhaps if we can find out exactly what initiates this stress in the cells, then we can stop it very early on in the disease and perhaps help the cells to deal with it better, and they won't go into that disease state. There's also recently been other papers from other countries, just one this week, that showed there was this chronic stress. It seems to be a real issue in MND and other neurodegenerative diseases. So it's something that is going to be a big target going forward, I think, to work out how we can stop that. And then the other study they did also was looking in those mouse models, and they look how does this TDP-43 also cause the cell death, and it also seems to be able to affect other other molecules of TDP-43. So some of the molecules are mutated or defective, but there are there's other TDP-43 in your cells, but it seems to infect those as well. So it shows that MND can start in one cell and it can spread to other cells. So they're looking at the mechanisms under that, because obviously it's not just one motor neuron that dies, it's all your motor neurons eventually. So they're trying to find out how this disease spreads through the body. It starts perhaps in one area, then obviously other limbs or other areas as the disease develops get affected. So this is giving us some ideas into how we can hopefully stop the spread as well. If we can stop it starting in the first place, that would be great. But once it starts, how do we stop it spreading? Some clinical trial updates. So also, obviously, everyone always has an interest in that. I'll start with the bad news, unfortunately. So there's, in the last few months, a few clinical trials have been stopped and pulled because they weren't working, basically. The Focus C9 trial, this was happening, part of this was in Australia. This is a genetic therapy specifically targeting people carrying the C9orf72 mutation. They did an interim analysis, what they call as an interim analysis. Basically, they have a peek at the data halfway through the trial. They found there was absolutely no benefit of taking this drug, and so they decided to stop the trial. This, unfortunately, combined with another trial that was stopped last year by another company called Ionis, shows that perhaps the simplistic approach to C9orf72 mutations is not the best approach, and we probably need to rethink how we can look at the people carrying the C9orf72 gene. Another trial that's called the Meridian trial was looking at complement protein. So this is complement system is a key part of your inflammatory system. So and it's thought to be involved in neuroinflammation, which is another disrupted system in MND. So they had a drug called Paquetá-Cedaplan, and they were testing that. Unfortunately, the trial finished. They analysed the results, and there was no effect of the drug. And a number of patients were on what they call open label extension. They were still receiving the drug after the trial finished, but they said there was no benefit to receiving that drug. So unfortunately, they stopped that as well. Another trial was Courage ALS. This has been run by a company called Cytokinetics. They have been a long-term supporter of MND. They've been working in this area for a long time, and they've been a really fantastic, not just MND, around the world, they've been a really good partner. And their drug, Rodelsmatif, looks at improves muscle skeletal contractility, therefore improves muscle function. And this is a very large phase 3 trial, but again, they undertook an interim analysis and found that it really wasn't providing any benefit. So unfortunately, they stopped that trial as well. Another company, Amylyx, they have a drug called Relvrio, was also called AMX0035. This was recently approved in the US for treatment, which obviously was great news, and I mentioned that last time. And now they're trying to apply to other countries to expand its access, and they just applied to the European Medical Agency, the EMA, and their committee who makes their decisions actually rejected the application. They feel that the evidence wasn't strong enough. This was based on a phase 2 trial, which is first time a drug for MND has been approved on the basis of a phase 2 trial, which are much smaller trials than the big phase 3 trials. So it was people were quite surprised when it was approved in the US, but perhaps less surprised that the European agency, which is traditionally much more conservative, said no. They're appealing this decision, and they also do have a phase 3 trial underway, which is going to finish next year. We've had initial discussions to try and convince them to come to Australia, but at the moment their focus is very much on Europe, unfortunately. So they're delaying their decision to come to smaller markets like Australia at the moment. But we'll be watching that closely, and we'll be in contact with them. On to more positive sort of advances in clinical trials. There's an organisation in the US called Synapticure. So this isn't directly applicable in Australia at the moment, but it is a really interesting study. So obviously, we know that a number of mutations directly contribute to developing MND, such as SOD1, C9orf72. So there's been a lot of discussion around whether people carrying those mutations should be entitled to receive treatment, which the best one at the moment is riluzole, before they even develop the disease. So they're actually the first sort of organisation that has decided to actually run a clinical trial or a trial looking at this. So they're going to, if you're carrying a mutation in MND, you can reach out and they will provide you with riluzole and then see if that delays the onset of disease. I mean, it's going to be a very long study, obviously, because you don't know how long it takes people to develop disease. But studies like this are becoming more and more apparent now. We're getting much better information about the genetics underlying MND, so we have a much better idea of perhaps who might develop the disease, and we need to know about what happens if you do provide those treatments either pre-disease development or very early in the disease. So this is these studies are incredibly useful and are going to be informative for everyone around the world. A trial called Miracles just finished end of last year, and it's studying a drug called low-dose interleukin-2. So there's a type of cell called regulatory T cells that regulate your immune system. So these are, the immune system is basically what drives inflammation and obviously protects you from diseases and bugs, but a key part of it is it drives inflammation. That's inflammation is how the immune system works and basically destroys cells it doesn't want in the body and destroys foreign bodies. The problem is when inflammation gets out of control, it can then harm good cells, and this is what happens with neuroinflammation, in that inflammation has got out of control and it's harming your brain cells. So there's a set of cells within the immune system that tamp down, that slow down the inflammation. So you've got cells that cause the inflammation and you've got cells that sort of stop the inflammation. And regulatory T cells are the cells that can slow down the inflammation. So there is actually another study going on in the US where they're looking at actually taking regulatory T cells from patients and putting them back into them to try and boost their numbers and boost in higher numbers of regulatory T cells to see if it can slow down disease. And that's in clinical trial at the moment, but it's a very expensive and a very slow way to do it. So there's this drug called interleukin-2 actually stimulates the numbers of regulatory T cells in your body. So they've, instead of putting cells into you, they just treat you with a drug that increases the cell numbers. And so it has to be low dose interleukin-2 because high dose interleukin-2 is actually used as a cancer drug and can kill cells that you want to keep. So they just finished a long trial and they had some quite positive results from that trial. So it didn't absolutely improve your the outcomes for the patients, but there was a subset of patients that who had low, so basically earlier in the disease, low to moderate levels of neurofilament heavy chain. This is a biomarker that measures basically motor neuron death. As motor neurons die, they release these neurofilament chains, and the higher levels of neurofilament you have, the probably means the more motor neurons have died. So they've shown in patients a bit earlier, which in the disease process, probably about 80% of the population, that it did actually have significant slowing of progression. So, and they said there's a decrease in death risk, a risk of death of over 40% after 2 years or almost 2 years of taking this drug. So this is actually very promising. This drug has already been approved. It's already used in other diseases. So we're now waiting to follow this. This was done in Europe and the UK. So we're now waiting to see what happens with that. So there's a company that now been licensed to develop a specific version of this for an MND treatment. Though the question is, why do they need a specific MND version? The drug is safe, it's well used. So we'll be watching what happens. I mean, what the next steps in this are. So this is actually incredibly promising. So people are watching this very carefully. Right, you may well have heard about tofersen being approved as well. Tofersen is a drug that specifically targets people carrying the SOD1 mutation. And this has recently been approved by the USA, the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. They've now called it Qalsody, not tofersen. For whatever reason, drug companies like to give their drugs clever names, and this is now going to be available in the US. They have not come to Australia yet, but anyone carrying the SOD1 mutation in Australia is eligible to get the drug for free from Biogen anyway. So if you know you carry that mutation, then we have information on our website. You can, your clinician, your neurologist, can apply directly to Biogen for access to the drug. So we're quite fortunate over here at the moment that it's still available. But Biogen we've spoken to Biogen as soon as they're applying to Europe at the moment. And as soon as the European application is finished, they'll be coming to Australia. So it will be available here, hopefully as a treatment soon. But for now, you can still access the drug. Interestingly, another company called Arrowhead Pharmaceuticals has another version of the drug, which also targets SOD1. And they're just had approval to start a trial in Australia. So we'll be hopefully there'll be choices within Australia in the near future, which is good, obviously, because that drives down the price of pharmaceuticals. You know, because unfortunately they are very expensive, especially in MND because there aren't many. So the more treatment options we have, one is that you can get personalized medicine. Two, it brings down the price of the treatments if there's competition in the market. This is another study that's going on in the US. So you're probably aware that a number of patients suffer bulbar functions, so speech and swallowing is affected. And we really don't have any treatments specifically aimed at these bulbar functions. So a group in Florida in the US have evaluated the short-term impact of a drug called Neurodextra. So this is approved in the US, but not in Australia, I believe. I don't know if you have any better ideas, Sandra. The treatment of excessive laughing or crying, basically, or involuntary emotional expression known as emotional liability or pseudo-bulbar effect. They tested it for 4 weeks in a small group of 30 patients, and they showed that on the bulbar subscale score of SFRR, that it showed significant increases as well as improvements in functional swallowing or speech. So this is the first time someone's actually looked at a direct intervention or a pharmacological intervention in this space. So that again is showing promise. It's a small trial, obviously only short term, but hopefully this will lead to further larger trials to look at this drug, and hopefully then it gives us opportunities to bring it to Australia once it's been well established as it being an effective treatment.
I did have a client, Gethin, just to butt-in, who
Yes.
I've had a couple of clients over the years, one gentleman who did have uncontrollable crying. So that's a great knowing that something's out there.
Yeah, so yeah, I've had a look, and I was quite surprised it wasn't available in Australia. I'm not exactly sure why. But again, I think as you know, we get more sort of concrete evidence that this is a really effective drug, then we can start lobbying to bring it here. Again, sort of moving slightly away from clinical trials here, but this is something again which is becoming more of an issue for people living with MND. Genetic discrimination in life insurance. So as you know, we're getting a much better understanding of the genetic sort of background of people with MND. We know there's a number of mutations that contribute quite significantly to the disease, and unfortunately, if you do carry the SOD1 or the C9orf72 mutation, there's a very high chance you will develop MND at some point in your life. So unfortunately, life insurance companies are now deciding, well, or want to find out about this information and then use it perhaps to refuse you life insurance. Australia's been pretty good here. They have got on the front foot with this, and they had a parliamentary inquiry into this back in 2018, and they implemented a moratorium or a ban on the use of life insurance companies being able to use genetic test results in life insurance. This isn't about MND. This could be for a lot of diseases, Huntington's. There's, obviously, there's certain mutations that predispose you to cancer. It's not an MND specific thing, but it has relevance to MND. So basically, the problem is this was a moratorium. It was industry self-regulated. We all, without being too blasé about this, we all know how industry self-regulation works very poorly. As soon as money and self-interest comes into it. So the government had another look at this moratorium and decided it was inadequate. So this report has come out and it basically said this needs to be legislated. There has to be a prohibition on life insurance companies being able to use genetic testing in their consideration of whether to offer you life insurance and the price of that life insurance. So I think, again, this obviously doesn't relate to treatments, but it does relate to very much quality of life and in helping and making sure that we don't get discrimination against MND patients. So we're very supportive of that, and hopefully that legislation will be moving through government as we speak. Where we go next? Okay, this is just something quirky. So I said I'm not going to offer you a complete overview of the whole MND research going around the world because you'd be here for hours. But I will. I've picked up a few things. If you ever read my research directions bulletin, sorry, you may have seen some of these things, but I'm always the advantage I can explain them in a bit more detail today, and also you can ask me questions. This is something that came up in a study in Colombia, actually. It's not MND, but it is again related to it. So there's a very large extended family, 6,000 people in Colombia, that develop Alzheimer's have early onset Alzheimer's, and it's due to a genetic mutation in a drug called the PASA gene. So what they found in that one member of that family had a second mutation that actually meant he didn't get the disease until he was 67. Rather than in his early 40s. And basically what happens is we're always looking for mutations that cause disease. We never look for mutations that stop disease. And this is a really interesting study where they've actually identified a pathway that prevents disease. And we don't see that very often. And it really supports us building our genetic studies up more, because the more information we have, then we don't know if there are patients with C9orf72 mutations that perhaps have a second mutation that protects them from that as well. And we need to keep following these patients, look at their genetic makeup and see if there's other ways we can target the disease. Because once you find a mutation, that tells you a pathway, and perhaps might identify a brand new pathway that can protect you or can be targeted for developing treatment. Back to Australia, so there's a couple of new trials that are starting up in Australia as well. I did mention this last one, it hasn't quite started yet. So lithium, testing lithium carbonate. They did a trial a few years ago testing lithium carbonate, and it didn't work. Basically, it had negative results. But what they found out that if you carry a mutation in the gene UNC13A, and it's probably about 15% of people, then this lithium carbonate did seem to work. So now they've made a bigger trial, developed a bigger trial where they're going to only test the drug on people that carry this UNC13A mutation. And this is happening will be happening in Australia. There's going to be 7 sites right across the country, including Brisbane. So again, it's an encouragement to get genetic testing. It will be provided as part of the trial as well, and then perhaps you'll be eligible for this trial. And they're currently just finalising all the details, so literally it will be starting any time in the next week or two, I think. Another trial that I know is happening in Brisbane through Rob Henderson's group. It's called the Cardinals trial, testing a drug called utrelelexostat. I wish they'd pick easier names for drugs. And this drug basically looks at reducing the levels of oxidative stress in your cells. So basically, I talked previously about the levels of stress in cells. Oxidative stress is another form. That's the pathway that edaravone, another drug that's been approved in some countries, and recently in Australia has targets that, but this is a more effective reducer of oxidative stress. So it's a pretty simple twice-a-day oral solution, and it's a 6-week trial, a 6-month trial. So that's recruiting in Brisbane. So anyone who's interested in that, I'd recommend talking to Rob Henderson about it. And find out what the exact criteria are. A couple of other trials that are also ongoing that I've mentioned previously. We have the Lighthouse trial, which tests an antiretroviral therapy called Triumeq. So people have shown that what they call endogenous retroviruses, these are retroviruses, so basically viruses that have embedded into your DNA, into your genome. Everyone carries them. They appear to be in higher levels in people with MND. They did a phase 2 trial that had promising results, showed that if you treat people with antiretroviral therapies, their MND improved. So they're now doing a much larger phase 3 trial, which can run up to 2 years actually, and they're looking at actual survival of patients. That trial is happening right across Australia. It was actually initiated by an Australian researcher. And it has very broad inclusion criteria as well. So those of you that may not be eligible for some of the other trials, which are quite tight, this one is quite inclusive. And we're, again, as with all trials, we're very hopeful of positive results. Another one, again, is another Australian-initiated trial. I've mentioned it previously, is looking at Ambroxol, which is actually a cough medicine. But it also restores lipid metabolism is one of the other things it does. And so basically how your cells handle the fats like cholesterol, etc. And this appears to be dysfunctional in people with MND. So it's a phase 2 trial. I don't think it's happening in Brisbane at the moment, though you might want to double check with your neurologist, whoever it is you see, your physician. But it's again, it came out of the Florey Centre, a researcher called Brad Turner at the Florey Centre, the Florey Institute in Melbourne. And again, this is a phase 2, a small phase 2 trial, but again, we're hopeful for results, and it's great to see research coming out of Australia that's going into clinical trial. And that takes me to the end of a bit of a whirlwind tour of obviously a huge area. So again, we have a clinical trial page on our website. I do apologise that it's not always up to date, but we try to do our best. You can follow the MNDRA Twitter feed. I try and identify a few interesting things. We're on LinkedIn and Facebook. We have our advanced newsletter, comes out 6 monthly. Our next State of Play, I think, is next week. So that's a monthly webinar series. We aim very much at our patients and the community. We'll be running our next Clinical Research Learning Institute, which is an opportunity for community members to learn more, a 2-day workshop on the real ins and outs of research. We teach you to read a research paper, how to look at stats and all things like that if you're really interested in engaging in research. I'm not sure exactly when that's going to be, but it will be this year sometime. And we have some guests from the US who help run that, who develop the Clinical Research Learning Institute, which are fantastic. Then there's other great resources such as the Alliance, briefing notes about trial outcomes. If you're ever thinking about a treatment, you're not quite sure about it, go onto the ALS Untangled website. They have an amazing, they've tested a lot of, or done a literature review of a lot of the more fringe treatments out there, and give you a really good balanced view of whether they think it's worthwhile investing in some of these more alternative treatments. And I said forthcoming here, but that's now comes out. There's a monthly update from me that comes out called Research Directions. And again, it's a snapshot of what I think has happened interestingly in the research world. So I think that's all for now. I think I've spoken for long enough, and hopefully you're not too glazed over.
No, it's been extremely, I've written lots of notes, extremely interesting. So Marie, way back when we were talking about the SOD1 gene, you put your hand up. I'm thinking, I hope she's actually writing notes down. So
oh, sorry,
Marie,
I didn't see the hand up,
no,
Marie.
no, which ask your question away.
You're still on mute.
Yes, if you want to unmute yourself. Can you do that?
Hi, Gethin.
Yeah.
Do you know if I113T subgroup in SOD1 is the same as I114T?
Sorry, no, that's way beyond my my genetic.
Okay.
That to me would suggest it's at a different place in the gene.
Yes.
So
It's just that I was told that it's been renamed, and I was wondering, because it leads into my next question, which is why.
If it's just been renamed, it may be that quite often they will decide that the numbering is slightly wrong because it's and so I suspect 113 IT is the same as 114 IT.
Okay.
I don't imagine it'd be the same mutation next to each other.
Okay, now my next question flows on from that, and that is that the Atlas trial, which you're aware of, I know.
Yep.
Why are they excluding I114Ts from that? Do you know?
The only reason I think would be because they just they haven't actually tested it to see whether it has benefit for that particular mutation. It may have been that mutation may have been not proven, but a lot of the mutations have been discovered subsequent to perhaps when the drug was developed more recently, as they kind of discover more and more. So I think what will happen is as this field develops, more and more mutations will be included in the in the inclusion criteria. So I don't know exactly why specific mutations aren't included.
Because that one is the one that most Australians have.
Oh, okay.
I believe. So therefore, Tofersen, given the early access program, would that also exclude that specific subgene?
Okay, look, I'm going to take that one on notice and go back to you. I'll talk to the guys at Macquarie because they're running the Atlas trial, and two, they're all genetic whiz kids down there. So they should know that off the top of their head. The other advantage may be that perhaps those other drugs coming in as well. I was saying about the other SOD1 trial, they may have broader inclusion as well against specific mutations. And
Okay.
I think that one's actually happening in the Sunshine. I think there's plans for that to go on the Sunshine Coast.
Hopefully.
But again, yeah, that we'll have to see that. Okay, but I'll take that on notice, and I'll follow that up with Macquarie University, and I'll let you know.
Okay. Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Thank you. So does anyone else have any other questions at all of Gethin?
They can be less technical, a bit
Sorry.
broad. But one thing I will say, I mean, you know, I did mention some trials that have failed, and obviously that's always disappointing, but it is important to know when a trial fails as well. It's you know, the worst thing we can have is oh, maybe I'm not sure, what do we do now type approach. Oh, we have to do another trial or something, and then that just sucks a whole bunch of time and money into it. So it's really important that these companies now are stepping up and doing the analysis, and even though they know it's going to cost them a shed load of money, and you know their investors and their share prices will drop, they're actually saying, no, this isn't working, we're going to and stop the trial and move on to other things. So I think even though it's initially disappointing, it is a good sign that I think we're getting better corporate responsibility from pharmaceutical companies, and that comes from pressure from people such as yourselves, who lived experience, the patient community, really getting strong and working with organisations such as us, the International Alliance, and saying, you know, this is not acceptable behaviour. You know, people are subjects; they're not. They're participants in these trials. They're partners in these trials, and it's really important that they hear about the outcomes. The Copper ATSM trial is a very poor example. I don't know if anyone here participated in that. They haven't announced the outcome of that trial. I don't believe patients know if they were blinded, unblinded, things like that. It's really poor, and we're trying the best we can to get information from the companies, those companies, so that they are hopefully becoming the outliers, and the good players are becoming more and more. And there's that pressure across there to engage with the community, to work with the community, to design trials that help patients as well. They're not like, okay, you've got to drive 500 miles and spend 3 days in our clinics, you know, when we can do half of this through telemedicine, you know, things like that, you know. So
Yeah.
we hope that it's improving, and there are more trials coming through. You know, as I said, Australia is becoming more and more appealing. I think in some ways. The US they're struggling to recruit people into trials. There's too many trials, not enough patients.
Yeah.
So people are coming to Australia. We have good resources, patients who are keen to engage, and I think we're in a good position.
Yeah. Thanks, Gethin. And you said last time, like if somebody wants to put their hand up for a trial, particularly the tofersen or the other ones that are available, so they literally will go through their neurologist for that referral?
Yeah. All trials, you have to discuss it with your neurologist. You can't enter a trial without one, you should always discuss any new treatments you're contemplating. It doesn't matter even if they're ones over the counter. It's always good to double check, because you never know, you know, all the different systems that can interact. But also, you can't engage in a clinical trial on your own. You have to be through your doctor.
Yes. Okay. No, thank you so much. There's so much happening in Queensland, as you've highlighted. There's also so much happening in Australia and also globally, and really appreciate your time today. Appreciate everyone coming on board.
Yep.
And hopefully we'll see you again for another update in 6 months' time. I think every 6 months is a really good, because I know that there's a lot of clients that are very, very interested in your field of research. So I really appreciate everything you and your teams are doing.
Yeah, no, I'm more than happy to keep coming back. 6 months is a great time because there's usually enough happening there, so I don't have to keep repeating myself, which is good.
Yeah. All right. So we'll stop recording now.
Great.
And
And good luck to everyone here with your own journeys as well. I mean, I very appreciate you taking the time to come on, and I realise that, you know, sometimes we feel like it's moving a bit slowly, but I can promise you, around the world, everyone is working extremely hard on this.
yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Gethin, for your time. Really appreciate it. And I'll bring up next. We actually have a Mindos coming in a couple of months' time on a similar segment. So that'd be great to find out how you can join into Mindos, which is very important for the continued research. We also have Gethin brought up about carers, so we also have a session supporting carers as well.
Yep.
In months to come.
Sign up to Mindos.
Yes, yes. Sign some Mindos. Take care, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again, Gethin. See you.